We're back again with another trade. Thank you for peeping Haynes on Hoops. I'm Quentin Haynes. Anfernee Simons and two second-round picks from Portland to Boston for Jrue Holiday. This makes it the second time within the last 3 years that Jrue Holiday has been a Blazer, and I think this stay is going to be a little bit longer than the one he had before. Let's talk about each team here and figure out what we're thinking. With the Portland Trail Blazers, I think the first thing that pops out is that they're building a nice defensive core. They were 16th in the league defensively last year, but I think the one of the bigger aspects of last season that kind of popped out at everybody was Tamani Kamara becoming really an all-world defender. He was at least one of the 10 best defenders in the league last season. Denny Avia, for his skill set and things off the court, is a good defensive player. Donovan Clingan, who I liked, I thought he was the best player of the draft, and I thought he should have went number one for his defensive ability and passing. Had moments where he looked like that dominant level defender at UConn, right? You combine those three with a veteran defender like Jrue Holiday, who admittingly took a little bit of a step back this past season, just a step back in general, from the elite player, role player he was a couple years prior. I think Portland's building a nice defensive core here, and I think the main thing is whoever they plug into those ancillary spots around these guys. You now have four of them. You can keep three, put two guys on the floor who may give you a little bit more offensively and who needs a little bit of shepherding on defense. I kind of like that aspect the most for the Blazers, and then you have Chauncey Billups, who I feel like, even though Chauncey has been up and down as a coach, I feel like defense is one of the things very he's been very critical on during his Blazers tenure. So getting him these guys and getting different options, I think, is a good thing for the Blazers here, and that's ultimately where we jump off with the young players. I don't know what to make with Scoot Henderson and Shaedon Sharpe, right? Shaedon Sharpe is entering year 4. And I don't know how good he is. He averaged 18.5 points last season, but he shot 31% from three. There's not a lot of defensive ability there. I think he's one of these good players who can do a couple things, but I don't think he's a special player. What do you pay that guy? We just seen a guy like Jalen Green get paid a weird contract from Houston, a very interesting contract from Houston, then flipped the year later just to get off of him to get Kevin Durant. I wonder what Shaedon Sharpe in Portland thinks of what their next contract looks like. And as for Scoot Henderson, I mean, I feel like we've criticized Scoot enough at this stage. He's still figuring it out. He took steps forward this past year. He shot better from three. I still like the defense. I think he's a underrated defender. Even though the numbers may not stand out in that area, he did take a huge jump in terms of defensive box plus minus. His defensive plus minus, his EPM took a step forward as well. I just kind of wonder now, as he enters his age 21 season, what are we expecting from Scoot? And the pressure is off, right? Guys like Holiday and Avia can create and generate shots, so he doesn't have to be the lead guard all the time. He doesn't have to generate all the shots. I just wonder what happens next season and how we go from there, because the Blazers, with this Holiday trade, kind of move into a space where they want to compete to make the playoffs. And if Scoot doesn't take a massive step forward, I just wonder what they do from there and how to approach that. He's entering his third year, so we are now over the halfway point of his rookie contract. What's the next step? Some would say that he's not playing well enough to even have that choice, right? If the Blazers got to do what the Blazers got to do, and that involves Scoot Henderson on the bench, it is what it is. But I like to think a team, a quote-unquote small market franchise like the Blazers, do kind of want to keep Scoot on the peripheral, and hopefully he turns things around, right? He's not going to be the generational prospect he was before, but maybe he can become a good point guard. And he's still 20 years old, right? He's entering his age 21 season, and I think you look at the head coach that he's under in Chauncey Billups, and you just don't want to completely sell him up the river as a young point guard, right? I do think throwing him into the mix, giving him multiple ball handlers and creators alongside of him has kind of helped him in his career. But it's kind of time to see Scoot take that step forward. And I think the atmosphere, everything around this Blazers team in terms of the defenders around him, the floor spacers, the the creative big man that you can work with and pick and roll, and a guy like Klingon, I think it's time for Scoot to kind of get aggressive. Or I don't know what the next step is. Shaden Sharp, obviously, he's going to be looking for a big contract. It'll be interesting to see what the Blazers do there. But Scoot entering his age 21 season, in a way, not similar to Cade Cunningham. I don't want to say that. I think Cade really took a monstrous step forward, and he's been better than Scoot in every season that they've been in the league together. I just think the transformative piece for the Blazers is Scoot becoming a good NBA player. I also want to talk about this roster still. I think the Blazers are not done with their offseason revamp. I think it's easy to say they kind of have their 5, 6, 7 guys, but when you look at the roster, they have too many guys, right? It's Jeremy Grant, it's DeAndre Ayton, two guys who played under 50 games last season. They already traded Simons. They bring in Holiday, so it's a swap there. They just picked up Matisse Thybulle's option. Delano Blanton looked interesting in the second half of the year. You still have Robert Williams, Time Lord, off the bench when he's healthy. It's just a lot still going on there, and I kind of want them to take another trade. Maybe find a trade in which you can get a future asset or two, right? I think the Blazers would be interesting if they were able to get like a 2027 first. Just another asset they could keep in the back for a second as they continue to figure out this roster. This is still a pretty young roster, right? Tamani Kamara is 24. Denny Avdia is 24. Scoot is 20. Shaden Sharp is 21. Donovan Clingan is 20. You know, you're adding Jrue Holiday, who's going to be the unk of the team. You know, and you still have some guys like if you keep Grant, he's 30. You know, Matisse Thybulle's 27. But this is still a young team, right? So I just think that now that you kind of have a defensive nucleus and you have a win condition, you have a direction, I think you need to kind of clear out some of the fodder of yesteryear, the Dame era, that period where they went from we are trying to compete with Dame to we are trying to compete with Dame but also keep the future. We are now just worried about the future. They kind of still have a lot of the pieces, the debris from those eras. And I think now that the Blazers are on the way up, which we'll talk about at the end here, I think it's kind of time to clean that off. You know, I think it's time to look at some trades and figure some things out. And lastly, with the Blazers, one thing I want to talk about is they kind of needed to make this trade, even though I think a lot of people look and say, why are you trading a 25-year-old Simons, who we'll get to in a little bit more in detail in a bit, for a veteran like Holiday, who feel like he took steps back last season. He's older, so obviously. But they missed the playoffs. It's the fourth year in a row they were out of the playoffs, right? And I just think it's kind of time, right? I think you got to have to figure out, okay, are we getting closer or are we not getting closer? What do we need to do? You know? And I think this trade ultimately gave them a good bump in making it into the play-in, right? Last season, they had a miraculous second half, and I think a lot of things on paper looked good for them. They finished 12th in the conference. They won 36 games, which isn't great, but you look at that Memphis, Sacramento, Dallas, Phoenix stack of teams, I think the Blazers made a smart trade to kind of get ahead of maybe a Phoenix, obviously a Phoenix now that Kevin Durant is in Houston, and maybe even a Sacramento depending on their offseason plaudits. Memphis and Dallas I'm a little bit higher on, but the Blazers made a move to push for the play-in, and they kept their young guys, so they didn't really give up too much, even though it's a weird trade because Simons is a good player. I think the Blazers decided that we need to take this now step. We need to make this playoff step so that we can figure out the rest from here. And I think ultimately, I feel like teams like this get rewarded, right? Maybe they make the play-in. It would be cool to see the Blazers make the play-in, win a game, and they get the AFC. Who cares if they get blitzed by Oklahoma City? Who cares if they get blitzed by a Houston? Who cares if they run into Denver and they get gentlemen swept? Getting those guys those reps and understanding where you are with a 25-year-old Tamani Kamara, who you have to pay in a bit, Denny Avia, who's under a nice contract, a Donovan Clingan, getting playoff reps, getting the best rim runners, the best attackers, the best players. Him being a focal point of the scouting report. Whether it's, hey, we got to make sure that we get our shots off before we get to Clingan at the rim, or hey, pull him from the rim. Let's see what he can do in space. The ability to be attacked creates the ability to develop and fix those aspects of your game. I would love to see the Blazers make the playoffs this year and kind of take that step forward. So ultimately, I think the Blazers did okay here. I understand the trade, even though on the Boston side of things, I think the Celtics ultimately won the trade. Anfernee Simons, you start here. He's one of the worst defensive players in the league, bar none. That's fine. It happens. That's life. He's averaged 19.3 points, 4.8 assists last season, plus he shot 36% from three on what we would consider plus volume, was like 8 attempts per night. He's a good offensive threat, right? And you look about the Boston Celtics, I'm going to refer to this team as the gap year Celtics. You look at the gap year Celtics, no Tatum, Al Horford's older. You trade Jrue Holiday, you bring in a guy like Anfernee Simons. I kind of like Simons in that role as the second scorer alongside Jaylen Brown. And then you have Derek White in between those two, and you still have some shoot. You still have good shooting there. You just have a guy in Simons who can get you 40, who can average 23, 24 a night, and he's still just 25. He's going to enter his age 26 season next year. I think the Celtics, for what they're doing in this gap year, I think this was a good step and a good start towards kind of revamping this team once Tatum comes back, right? The thing about Simons that's interesting is this is the last year of his deal. He makes about $27 million. Are the Celtics going to re-sign him, right? They're doing a lot of tricks to get under that second apron now. So I think Porzingis, who we'll talk about in a second, will be another casualty of this team. But, what's he going to demand? If the Celtics are better than expected and he's the second scorer on that team, he's going to enter free agency age 27, entering his age 27 year with some stripes, right? So it's just interesting to see what the Celtics do and how they approach that. Is this someone you can maybe get at a lower rate, right? Hey, you come back to Boston maybe at something around 30, something touching $30 million a year. You're in a world where Jayson Tatum comes back at 100%. It's Tatum as your 1, Brown as your 2, Simons as your 3 offensively, and then you allow Brad Stevens to kind of figure out the pieces from there. I'm interested. I'm intrigued. Ultimately, I think Simons is a player that keep an eye on for some awards. I don't think he'll get most improved, right? He's been this kind of level for some time now, but he'll get some buzz. He'll get some considerable buzz. I also think from another perspective that if the Celtics really wanted to, they also improved the trade value of that financial slot. Because I look at Jrue Holiday, and as talented as he is, and this is a little hypocritical because the team that just traded for him isn't a title contender, but I think Jrue Holiday's market, if he were placed on the trade market in the middle of a season, is this guy can play 7th man, 6th man minutes defensively. He's big. He can play for us. We can add him for this playoff push, and we can go and become a potential championship team. That's the final piece, right? Whereas I think Simons has a little bit more versatility as a trade value chip. 26 years old. He's young. He can be a piece to someone's long-term vision. He's a good scorer. So maybe you're a team that's, hypothetically speaking, if Orlando didn't make the Desmond Bane trade, Simons would have been an interesting fit there, right? Team that needs, like Toronto. I think Toronto just kind of needs that shooter who can just launch a bunch of threes. Even though they don't really need a point guard per se, I think Quigley is fine. They just kind of need another shot generator between him and Scotty Barnes. But yeah, Simons is a different type of trade chip, and I just wonder if things get a little bit rocky in Boston, if they try to use him as a trade chip and what that value looks like. I think it'll be a decent chip and a decent piece back. You know, second round picks are second round picks. They're assets that you can throw in potential trades. They're the cherries on top, right? And then when you have to use them, you know, they're often used and thrown away, discarded, or they can become a Tamani Kamara, right? Or you think about any other second round pick that gave you a couple good years and you're fine with it. You know, who knows, right? And this is a team in Boston that has done a good job at scouting, I would say, over the last few years. They've done a good job at hitting on the exact players that they need for their roster. Even a guy like uh, Welsh, who hasn't really taken a step forward this past year, I think he was a fine pick. He was someone that he was a defensive-minded wing who can kind of come in and help and do things, and it just hasn't worked out yet. You know, they also have like a Luke Cornett situation. Luke Cornett may get paid. They found guys like Sam Hauser. Jordan Walsh is the player. I mean, I said Welsh. It's Jordan Walsh. You know, second year he got a couple of looks. You know, they brought in the right guys like Xavier Tillman. They drafted Baylor Schneiderman last year. J.D. Davison a couple of years ago. He finally got some run with the big team. You know, I think the Celtics are pretty good at figuring out both culturally what they need as well as the fit around their guys. Once I'm interested in what the movement with Porzingis will be, but I kind of like Simons as the third guy behind potentially Tatum when he returns and Jaylen Brown. Porzingis. I don't know. I don't know who's trading for value for him, right? I think he's still a good player. I think he provides a specific skill set when he's healthy. The issue is he's never healthy. Not at the level that you want, right? Even when the Celtics this year, 42 games for Porzingis, mysterious illness. I don't want to talk about it, but the year before, 57 games. The year before that, when he was in Washington and where he had like a bit of a renaissance breakout season, 65 games. Year before that, 51 games. You know, so it's just like this guy is going to be making somewhere north of $60 million the next 2 years. He gets 29.2. He gets 30.7 next year. I swore he signed an extension. Regardless, this is a guy who I just kind of question what you're doing there. You're trading for him. What exactly are you aiming for there? And how good is your team around that? Because he's going to miss some games. I saw a rumor that the Spurs were interested in him. I don't like that for the Spurs. I don't like that. I just think you should keep your powder dry, because if you can get Giannis or you can get somebody else, I think that would be better. There's no team that sticks out to me that's like a Porzingis piece of intrigue. I guess that means that the obvious team will trade for him and everything will make sense. But the main point there is that the Celtics are tapping the second apron. They're going to go way over it, and they're going to try to make these trades with the intentions of ducking that. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means, you know, maybe a team with a bunch of cap space makes a move. Maybe someone finds Porzingis to be, hey, this guy's a former All-Star. This guy just needs a little bit more help. We can train him. We can work with him. I don't know who fits that mold, right? Just glancing at teams across the league, he's a little bit too expensive for Detroit. That would be interesting, though. But if you're Detroit, are you giving them value? I don't think you do that. Obviously, Brooklyn could just absorb the contract. I don't think Brooklyn would do that, though. You know, you look at the Western Conference, and a lot of those teams are gridlocked, both draft picks wise and financially. It would be kind of weird if you landed in Sacramento. You know, you look at Utah, if they wanted to take the contract and kind of flip him midway through the season. The team for Porzingis is just not sticking out right now. And that's a bit of a concern in terms of trading him. I feel like the Celtics always get it done because they're the Celtics, but I'm curious to see how this Porzingis deal plays out. At the time of recording this, he hasn't been traded. Jordan Poole has been traded, though. We'll talk about that in the next video. But overall, I'm interested in the gap year Celtics. They got a bunch of guards. They have an interesting combination of wings. They're just missing their top 5 player in the league, right? So that leads to Jaylen Brown getting a bump offensively, Anfernee Simons being more of a key vocal offensive piece. You know, is there any other Peyton Pritchard guy on this team. Maybe Schneiderman gets a collective set of minutes that allows him to establish himself in the Boston rotation. It's going to be interesting to see. Maybe the Porzingis trade bears fruit right away, right? Maybe you get a piece that could not only help you this year or looks interesting this year, but as Tatum comes back, he connects with Tatum in a way that can kind of transform the roster. So I'm interested to see the gap year Celtics, just kind of the same way, unfortunately, the gap year Pacers. We'll talk about them in future video. But overall, I think this trade is just one team in Boston who understands that this is now a period of pivot because of the Tatum injury, because of the financial constraints of the second apron, taking a shot on a young player who has clear warts, but clear strengths. And when his strengths matches with their strengths or their weaknesses, it allows them to kind of fill in a void that they lost with Tatum. I think the weaknesses of Simons can be fixed by Boston's strengths. So I'm curious to see if that. Also, I'm curious to see how he looks in a situation where you kind of have a more developed team, right? Before he was playing under Dame and they didn't really play a lot together. You didn't want to do that for defensive reasons. Then it was like the Dame era is ending. Dame got hurt the last couple of years. Then Simons took over, but you take over a team that's rebuilding. Now he's on a team that has some true competitive NBA players. I'm curious to see how that looks. For the Blazers, this is a team that has missed the playoffs the last 4 years, have accumulated talent, and it's kind of time to see where we're at. This team added Scoot. This team added Shaedon Sharpe. They added guys like Toumani Camara and Denny Avdia in trade. They drafted Donovan Clingan last year, who seemed to be the highest floor of the draft, at least in my opinion. And they made strides, right? They won 36 games, and now it's time to see if they can take that next step. The Holiday trade doesn't turn them into a contender overnight, doesn't turn them into a top 6 lock in the West overnight, but it gets you to that point where you can make the play-in and then you can figure everything else out, right? And for young teams, even though I don't like the play-in, because it just makes everything murky at the end of the season, and it kind of hurts the trade deadline and teams that understand they're out of it. So let's make this trade versus teams that are like, we're 2 games out of the play-in. Let's try to make the play-in. I think Portland is a team that would be interesting from the standpoint of if they get in, you now all of a sudden have the data points to make the next move, right? And if they truly become a transformative team, if they truly jump into the top 6, that would mean that this defensive core of Holiday, Clingan, Avia, and Kamara also assisted in getting Shaedon Sharpe ready. Also insisted in Scoot Henderson taking a step forward, right? I think that's kind of what the Blazers want. In a perfect world, the Blazers win the title. But in a world where things click for next season, they make the playoffs, they lose in the first round, but you get Scoot taking a considerable step forward, entering his 4th season after next year, obviously. You have Shaedon Sharpe locked in on a considerable contract and taking a step forward as an offensive threat. You moved out some of the pieces that didn't really matter to this long-term project. You got some long-term assets for it. And this team now has the feel of the next Detroit, where it's like, hey, 2026, 27, the Blazers could be a top 6 team in the West. You don't want to play them. They're good defensively. They get after it. Only time will tell if that will happen, but I think this is what they want from that trade. I'm Quentin Haynes. Thank you for listening.